In Chapter 1, we'll examine how to set up your project. The goal of this chapter is learning how to work with various media content and then prepare the content to start editing in Photoshop. First, we'll learn how to import your creative content from various devices, such as a camera, a card reader, or your smartphone, and then open the content into Photoshop. And second, we'll learn how to use Photoshop's Camera Raw plugin to enhance your raw files before rendering them into Photoshop.
Before we work with our photos in Photoshop, we first need to import them to our computer. So let's learn how to transfer images from our SD card or compact flash card to our computer. First, we'll attach to our computer a card reader with our media card already inserted. A quick side note, many computers have media slots built into them, so a card reader might be unnecessary. On Windows, the Autoplay dialog box should open and you can select Open Folders to view files. If it doesn't open for you, then navigate to your computer and double-click on the media card to open it. Once the media card is open, drag the DCIM folder, or whatever your media folder is called, and drag it to whatever destination you want to save it to your computer. I prefer saving all of my media files on an external drive that I regularly back up in case of a hard drive failure. And if you're on a Mac, then the process is very similar, although you would first start from your desktop and double-click on the media icon when it shows up. You can then transfer your files to your desired location, like mentioned previously. Now that we've seen how to transfer our images to our computer from our media card, let's learn about working with raw files. First, let's open a raw file. From Photoshop, go to File, Open, and select Raw Photo _Cowboy and click Open. What is a raw file and how does it differ from the JPEG photos your camera processes by default? A camera raw file contains all of the information our camera sensor was able to capture. This is different from a JPEG in that when you shoot JPEG files with your camera, the camera automatically processes the JPEG file to enhance and compress the image. You generally have little control over how this processing occurs. Shooting camera raw images with your camera gives you greater control than shooting JPEG images because camera raw does not lock you into processing done by your camera. Think of a camera raw file as your photo negative. You can reprocess the file at any time, achieving the results that you want by making adjustments for white balance, tonal range, contrast, color saturation, and sharpening. When you adjust a camera raw image, the original camera raw data is preserved. Adjustments are stored as metadata in an accompanying sidecar file, in a database, or in the file itself, in the case of a DNG format. To shoot camera raw images, you must set your camera to save file in its own camera raw file format. So, now that we learned a little bit about raw files, let's get started working with this photographic raw file. First, we'll look at our white balance controls and choose a color temperature and tint that fits our aesthetic. Do we want an image that's warm or cool? Tint sets the white balance to compensate for a green or magenta tint. Decrease tint to add green to the image. Increase tint to add magenta. For example, if I had a green bias tint, I'd drag the slider towards magenta, which is the complementary color of green, to neutralize it. Now we'll adjust the tones in our image. Exposure adjusts the overall image brightness. If we drag the slider to the right, we increase the exposure. If we drag it to the left, we decrease the exposure. Exposure values are in increments equivalent to aperture values, or f-stops, on a camera. An adjustment of +1 is similar to opening the aperture one stop. Similarly, an adjustment of -1 is like closing the aperture one stop. I'd like to add a little more punch to this photo, so I'll increase the contrast by dragging the contrast slider to the right. When you increase contrast, the middle to dark image areas become darker, and the middle to light image areas become lighter. If we want to decrease the contrast in the image, we would drag the contrast slider to the left. These clouds have excellent detail in the highlights and bright image areas. However, if they didn't and the highlights were overexposed in areas, we would drag the slider to the left to darken the highlights and recover blown out highlight details. Likewise, if we wanted to brighten the highlights, we would drag the slider to the right to brighten highlights while minimizing clipping. I would like to see more detail in the shadow areas, so I'll drag the shadow slider to the right. Now, this will open up the detail in the shadow areas. Shadows adjust dark image areas. If we were to drag to the left, this would darken the shadows while minimizing clipping. Drag to the right to brighten shadows and recover shadow details. To make the clouds a little more light, I'll increase the whites. Whites adjust white clipping. We drag to the left to reduce clipping in highlights, and we drag to the right to increase highlight clipping. Increased clipping may be desirable for specular highlights such as metallic surfaces. To make the blacks a little more rich, I might drag the slider to the left. Blacks adjust black clipping. We drag to the left to increase black clipping, which maps more shadows to pure black, and we drag to the right to reduce shadow clipping. Let's look at the clarity, vibrance, and saturation controls. You can change the color saturation of all colors by adjusting the clarity, vibrance, and saturation controls on the basic tab. If we wanted to adjust saturation for a specific range of colors, we'd use the controls of the HSL Grayscale tab. Now, I'd like to add depth to this image, so I'm going to increase the clarity. Clarity increases local contrast, with greatest effect on the midtones. This setting is like a large radius unsharp mask. When using this setting, it is best to zoom into 100% or greater. To maximize the effect of clarity, we increase the setting until we see halos near the edge details of the image, and then reduce the setting slightly. While I'm not going to increase the vibrance, which we'll learn about in Chapter 2, Adjustment Layers, you can if you want to, but be judicious in your use of it. Too much saturation will look unappealing. Vibrance adjusts the saturation so that clipping is minimized as colors approach full saturation. This setting changes the saturation of all lower saturated colors with less effect on the higher saturated colors. Vibrance also prevents skin tones from becoming oversaturated, or as I like to refer to as clown colors. I'd like to add a vignette, so I'll go to the Lens Correction tab and select Vignette. Dragging the sliders to the left darkens the vignette. Dragging to the right lightens the vignette. A quick note, if at all possible, do most of your global and localized adjustments to your photo using Adobe Camera Raw, as I just showed you. The reason is that you have more editing information to work with when using raw data. When your raw file gets processed into Photoshop as a rendered file, or if you're working with a JPEG file, the file has been compressed and you have less information to work with. Now that we learned how to work with our raw files using Adobe Camera Raw, join us in Chapter 2 as we learn how to apply non-destructive layer adjustments to our photos.